Hey guys, tonight we start with something a little darker. We're diving into the grim reality of being a woman in medieval Europe. Forget noble queens and fairy tale romances Hollywood sold you. The truth? You probably wouldn't last a single day. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just been born. The year is 1425. You're a tiny, red-faced baby girl fresh into the world after your mother endured labour without so much as a Tylenol. The midwife holds you up, and there's this collective sigh in the room. Not a daughter. In a world where physical strength equals survival, you're already at a disadvantage, and you haven't even opened your eyes yet. If you're lucky, your parents are somewhat pleased to see you. If not, well, let's just say many families consider daughters an economic burden rather than blessing. More mouths to feed with less ability to work the fields or defend the homestead. Not exactly winning the medieval lottery. Your first achievement is surviving birth itself. Around 20% of your tiny contemporaries won't make it past their first year. No antibiotics, no NICUs, just prayers, herbal remedies of questionable effectiveness. And if you're wealthy, perhaps a wet nurse whose own child may have already died. Your baptism happens quickly, sometimes within hours of birth, because infant mortality is so high that your parents are genuinely terrified your soul might end up in limbo if you die unbaptized. The local priest dunks you in cold water while reciting Latin phrases. Welcome to the world, little one. It's literally downhill from here. As a toddler, you don't get much time to play with those wooden dolls. By age 4, you're already learning how to be useful. While your brothers might be learning to swing tiny wooden swords, you're being taught to carry water, feed chickens, and keep your little fingers busy with simple tasks. Your childhood. It's basically an apprenticeship for a lifetime of domestic drudgery. By 6, you're expected to help mind younger siblings. Yes, there are usually several, because contraception consists mainly of prayers and herbs that do absolutely nothing. You're gathering eggs, plucking feathers from dead birds, and learning the fine art of staying out of the way when the men are talking. Your toys, miniature versions of the tools you'll use as an adult, little spinning wheels, tiny brooms, and if you're lucky, perhaps a rag doll that you're supposed to practice your nurturing skills on. Fun fact. Medieval child psychology consisted entirely of get them working as soon as humanly possible. Sleep doesn't come easy either. You're sharing a bed, if you can call a sack of straw a bed, with your siblings, possibly some cousins, and definitely some fleas. Privacy isn't just a luxury, it's a concept that won't be invented for several hundred more years. Your education begins and ends with domestic skills. Reading, writing, those fancy book things. Not for you, sweetheart. While the occasional merchant's daughter might learn basic reading for business, and noble girls might get enough education to manage household accounts, for most medieval girls, your curriculum is endless hands-on training in cooking, cleaning, sewing, brewing, preserving, gardening, animal husbandry, basic first aid, and the fine art of looking demurely at the ground when spoken to. If you're exceptionally lucky and born to nobility, you might learn to read religious texts, play an instrument or speak French, the language of the medieval elite. But don't get ideas about philosophy or mathematics. Those subjects might make your fragile female brain overheat, causing your womb to wander around your body and cause hysteria. Yes, that was actual medical science at the time. Your brothers might be sent to school or apprenticed in trades. You're getting the most important education of all, how to make yourself useful and marriageable. Because in about 10 more years, you'll be someone's wife. And not just anyone, whoever your father picks for you. Hope you like surprises. Speaking of marriage, hope you weren't planning on marrying for love. That adorable concept is still centuries away from catching on. Your marriage is essentially a business transaction, and you're the product being sold. Romantic, right? Your father's busy negotiating with potential suitors' families about your dowry, that delightful custom where your family pays someone to take you off their hands. The ideal age for your wedding? Somewhere between 12 and 16. Yes, you heard that correctly. while peasant girls might marry a bit later, which is around 16 to 18, because they needed to work and save up first, noble girls were often betrothed as children and married off the moment they hit puberty. Nothing says, "Congratulations on your first period," like being shipped off to live with a strange man twice your age. Your opinion on your future husband ranks somewhere below the family goats. The most input you might get is if your father asks, "Can you tolerate him enough not to poison his ale?" And even that's pushing it. If you're a peasant girl, you might at least know the guy. Perhaps a neighbour's son, or a young man from your village. If you're nobility, you might be meeting your husband for the first time at the altar. Surprise! And what if you don't want to marry? Well, there's always the convent, if your family can afford the donation to get you in. Otherwise, spinsterhood isn't exactly an appealing option, in a world where unmarried women are viewed with suspicion and have almost no economic opportunities. Choose your prison, ladies. Your wedding day arrives with all the romance of a cattle auction. The ceremony happens outside the church door. Yes, outside, because women are barely pure enough to enter holy spaces even on their wedding day. The priest drones on in Latin, which you don't understand because remember, no education for you. Your wedding dress isn't white. That tradition comes much later. You're wearing your best dress, which for peasant girls is just slightly less dirty than your everyday dress. If you're wealthy, you might get something colourful and new. The splurge here isn't for your benefit. It's to show off your family's wealth to the community. The feast afterward depends entirely on your social status. Peasant weddings might feature a slightly better than average meal with more ale than usual. Noble weddings are elaborate displays of conspicuous consumption, where guests stuff themselves while making increasingly crude jokes about what's going to happen in the bedchamber later. And speaking of that, your wedding night. Your female relatives might give you some vague, terrifying advice about lying back and thinking of England. Your duty is to consummate the marriage and start producing heirs, preferably male ones, as quickly as possible. In some regions, wedding guests might even hang around outside the bedchamber, listening for evidence of consummation. Nothing starts a marriage off right like performance anxiety with an audience. Now you're a married woman, and your day starts well before dawn. That rooster isn't just annoying, it's your medieval alarm clock. You drag yourself from that lumpy straw mattress while it's still dark outside because there's simply too much to do to waste daylight. Your husband might roll over and keep snoring, but your work begins immediately. First task, getting the fire going again from last night's banked coals. No matches, no lighters, just your skill with flint or, if those coals died completely, a panicked trip to borrow fire from a neighbour. The smoke fills your one-room home because chimneys are a luxury most people don't have. Instead, there's just a hole in the roof that theoretically lets some smoke out, while definitely letting rain in. Next, you're fetching water, not from a tap, but from the village well or nearest stream. Remember those cute exercise classes where people lift water jugs? This is that, except it's not optional. The jugs are heavy wooden buckets, and you'll do it multiple times a day until your back gives out around age 30. Your morning hygiene routine is blissfully brief. Washing your entire body? That's a special occasion thing that might happen a few times a year. Today, like most days, you splash some cold water on your face, maybe rinse your mouth out and smooth down your hair, which hasn't been washed in weeks. Deodorant doesn't exist, so everyone smells exactly as bad as you'd expect. The good news is you can't really notice because you're used to it, and honestly, everything smells terrible. With fire lit and water fetched, it's time for breakfast, which you have to make, of course. Hope you like pottage. That's the medieval staple food that's essentially gruel with whatever vegetables or scraps of meat you can throw in. It's bland, it's boring, and you'll be eating some version of it for practically every meal of your life. If your family has bread, you're making that too, not by popping down to the store, but by grinding the grain yourself in a hand mill, a process so tedious it literally inspired torture devices. The flour is mixed with water, maybe some ale yeast if you're brewing, and salt if you can afford it. Kneading bread dough isn't your cute weekend baking hobby. It's an upper body workout that you perform whether you're sick, pregnant, or just exhausted. The bread bakes in your hearth, or, if you're in a village with a communal oven, you'll pay the lord who owns it for the privilege of using it. And it's not that fluffy white sandwich bread you're thinking of. It's a dense, coarse loaf that gets harder as the week progresses. By day 5, you might need to soak it in broth, just to avoid breaking your teeth. And breakfast is just the beginning. Every meal requires hours of preparation with no refrigeration, no measuring cups, and recipes that exist only in your head because, again, you probably can't read. The pressure is immense. Waste food through poor preservation or cooking, and your family might not survive. When you're not cooking or cleaning or fetching water or milking goats, you're spinning. Always spinning. The textile work never, ever ends. That whole fairy tale about Sleeping Beauty pricking her finger on a spinning wheel, that's because spinning was so constant in women's lives that it became literally the thing that could kill you in stories. Spinning isn't a quaint hobby. It's economic necessity. Your family needs cloth for clothes, bedding, and countless other uses. And guess who makes every inch of that cloth from scratch? That's right, you do. The process is mind-numbingly tedious. First, you prepare the raw wool or flax, cleaning and carding it. Then you spin it into thread using a drop spindle or spinning wheel if you're lucky enough to have one. The wheel only shows up later in the medieval period, by the way. For centuries, it was just you and a stick with a weight on it, twirling for hours upon hours. Once you've spun enough thread, which takes forever, you weave it into cloth on a loom. Then you cut and sew that cloth into whatever's needed. No sewing machines, just needles you might have made yourself from bone, or purchased at great expense. Your eyes strain in the dim light as you make tiny stitches by hand. And you're doing all this while managing every other aspect of domestic life. Multitasking wasn't invented by modern working mums. Medieval women were the original productivity gurus. The economic value of your textile work is enormous, yet completely taken for granted. Your spinning and weaving might be sold at market or used to pay taxes, but you'll rarely get credit for this contribution to the family economy. Just another invisible female task that keeps the world turning while men take all the credit. Now, let's talk about the most dangerous thing you'll do in your medieval life. Have babies. Lots of them. With no reliable birth control, you're likely to be pregnant every couple of years from marriage until menopause, if you survive that long. Medieval pregnancy comes with zero prenatal care, no ultrasounds, no gestational diabetes screening, and absolutely no idea if something's wrong until it's usually too late to do anything about it. Your pregnancy cravings? Ignore them. Your morning sickness? Work through it. Your swollen ankles and back pain? There's water to fetch and cloth to weave. No time for complaints. While pregnant, you're subjected to bizarre dietary restrictions and even stranger advice. Don't look at a hair or your child might have a hair lip. Don't raise your arms above your head or the umbilical cord will strangle the baby. Every culture has its pregnancy superstitions, but medieval ones came with the added terror of having basically no medical knowledge to counterbalance them. When labour begins, you're attended by midwives, other women with practical experience but no formal medical training because, you guessed it, women aren't allowed to be doctors. Your birthing chamber is hot, dark and closed up tight because people believed fresh air was dangerous during childbirth. The pain relief options include biting on a leather strap, gripping a birthing stool, or praying really, really hard. Complications during birth? There's no C-section waiting as backup. It's you versus nature, and nature often wins. Maternal mortality rates hovered around 1 to 2% per birth. That doesn't sound high until you realise you might go through this 10 plus times in your life. Your lifetime risk of dying in childbirth could be as high as 10 to 15%. For comparison, your chance of dying in a car accident today is about 1%. You'd be safer texting while driving on a highway than giving birth in medieval Europe. Congratulations, you survived childbirth. Now you have a baby to keep alive in a world with no paediatricians, no vaccines, and where 1/3 of children don't make it to their 5th birthday. Your maternity leave consists of however long it takes the bleeding to stop, maybe a week if you're lucky, before you're back to all your regular duties, now with a newborn strapped to you. Breastfeeding is your only option unless you're wealthy enough to hire a wet nurse, and you'll nurse this baby for 2 to 3 years, partly for nutrition and partly as a not very effective form of birth control. The extended breastfeeding might delay your next pregnancy by a few months, giving your body the briefest recovery time before the whole cycle starts again. Your baby sleeps with you because there are no cribs, just swaddling cloths to wrap them tight so they can't move much and baskets or boxes to lay them in during the day. SIDS was a constant, unexplained terror. often attributed to evil spirits or changelings rather than any medical cause. Childcare isn't a separate task from your other work. It's just added on top. You strap that baby to your back or hip and keep working. Older children are put to work watching younger ones as soon as they're capable, creating a cascading system of child labour where 6-year-olds mind toddlers while you cook, clean, spin, weave, garden, and manage everything else. Discipline is harsh because the stakes are high. A child who doesn't listen might wander off and die. Better a smack now than a funeral later. There's no child psychology, no gentle parenting books, just the desperate need to raise children who will survive and eventually help with the workload. Let's say you develop a health problem, maybe from one of those difficult births, or from years of back-breaking labour, or just because medieval hygiene is a paradise for bacteria. What kind of medical care can you expect? Hope you like being blamed for your own illness. Women's medicine in the Middle Ages is a special kind of nightmare where everything wrong with you is somehow related to your uterus. Headache, wandering womb, digestive issues. Your uterus is obviously pressing on your stomach. Mental health concerns. Your womb is clearly sending toxic vapours to your brain. Blaming everything on a misbehaving uterus is like your car breaking down, and the mechanic saying, "Ah, yes, the cup holder is wandering again." Treatments range from useless to actively harmful. Bloodletting is a favourite. Nothing helps anemia like removing more blood. Herbal remedies might occasionally contain something effective, but dosages are wildly inconsistent. Prayer is prescribed alongside poultices, and neither does much for an infection. For specifically female complaints, the treatments get even weirder. Menstrual issues? Try sitting over a steaming pot of herbs, essentially a medieval vaginal steam that does absolutely nothing. Infertility? Perhaps wear special stones, consume specific animal parts, or make offerings at saints' shrines. Menopause symptoms? Clearly you're becoming a witch. Speaking of which, medical knowledge itself becomes dangerous for women. The village-wise woman who knows which herbs ease pain might be respected one day, and accused of witchcraft the next. The midwife who delivers babies successfully might be celebrated until one dies. Then she's suspected of dark arts. The line between healer and witch is terrifyingly thin, and it's drawn by men who are deeply uncomfortable with female knowledge of any kind. Now let's talk beauty standards, because even in an era where everyone smelled like a barnyard, women were still expected to look good. Medieval beauty ideals would make a modern Instagram influencer have a nervous breakdown. The ideal woman had pale skin indicating she was wealthy enough to stay indoors, a high forehead which was so fashionable that women plucked their hairlines back painfully, rosy cheeks, and a small mouth. How did you achieve this look without Sephora? With horrifying cosmetics, of course. Lead-based face powder gave you that fashionable deathly pallor, while slowly poisoning you. Rouge for your cheeks might contain mercury. And that stylish blonde hair that nobles coveted, achievable through mixtures involving lye that damaged your hair irreparably. Beauty was literally pain and poison. Hygiene was creative. Full-body bathing happened rarely, maybe a few times a year for average folks. Instead, you practiced spot cleaning the visible parts. Most people owned exactly one set of clothes, which they wore until they fell apart, occasionally airing them out but rarely washing them because, let's face it, they'd never fully dry in the damp European climate. Your teeth? Cleaned with cloth, and maybe some herb mixtures if you were fancy. Dental hygiene wasn't big, which explains why many medieval skulls are missing teeth by age 30. Your breath smelled like something died in your mouth, but so did everyone else's, so at least there was that solidarity. And let's not even start on menstrual hygiene. Your options included rags that you'd wash and reuse, or for poorer women, moss, hay, or whatever absorbent material was available. No tampons, no pads, no menstrual cups, just you, some scratchy linen, and a prayer that you wouldn't bleed through your only dress during church. On to everyone's favourite topic, medieval sex, or as I like to call it, duty with occasional pleasure if you're exceptionally lucky. Your body doesn't belong to you, it belongs first to your father, then to your husband. Sex isn't about your enjoyment, it's about reproduction and satisfying your husband's needs. The church had a lot to say about what you could and couldn't do in bed. Sex was forbidden on Sundays, religious holidays, during Lent, during Advent, during your period, and during pregnancy. When you add it all up, you were looking at about half the year when sex was technically a sin. But given that most peasants couldn't read church edicts and nobles often ignored them, these rules were broken constantly. Birth control existed but was wildly unreliable. Options included herbal concoctions that might terminate pregnancy, coitus interruptus, and amulets or magical spells that did absolutely nothing except make you feel like you were trying. Marital rape wasn't a concept. Your husband had a right to your body whether you wanted sex or not. Refusing him could be grounds for annulment or worse. And if you got pregnant from a rape, you were often blamed for it, because medieval science believed women could only conceive if they experienced pleasure during sex. Yes, this terrible idea persisted for centuries and was used to dismiss countless sexual assaults. But what if you wanted more control over your life? What legal rights did you have as a medieval woman? I hope you're sitting down for this because the answer is almost none. Legally, you existed in a perpetual state of dependence. First under your father's authority, then your husband's, and if widowed, potentially your eldest son's. As a married woman, you had no right to own property in most regions. Everything belonged to your husband, including any inheritance you received or wages you earned. You couldn't sign contracts, sue in court, or make legal decisions without a male representative. Your testimony in court carried less weight than a man's, and in some places you needed multiple female witnesses to equal one male witness. Even crimes against you were seen as crimes against the men who owned you. If you were assaulted, it was your father or husband who received compensation. Your value was calculated based on your virginity, reproductive capacity and labour value. Essentially, you were a walking, talking commodity with a calculable price tag. Widows had it marginally better in some regions, gaining control of property and business interests until remarriage, or until sons came of age. This brief window of independence made widowhood paradoxically desirable for some women, despite the economic hardship it often brought. Some widows fought tooth and nail to avoid remarriage just to maintain this small taste of autonomy. The one institution that offered women some structure and influence was the church, though even religious life came with strict limitations. The church was simultaneously your oppressor and your potential refuge. Daily religious observance gave rhythm to your life, the church bells marking time, the liturgical calendar determining feasts and fasts, the local parish serving as the centre of community life. For most women, religious participation meant attending Mass, confessing sins, and observing countless holy days that, coincidentally, often involved extra work for you in preparing special meals or cleaning. The church dictated almost every aspect of your existence, from when you could have sex to what you could eat on particular days. Religious authorities reinforced your subordinate position, pointing to Eve's sin as proof of women's inherently corrupting nature. Many sermons reminded women they were responsible for humanity's fall from grace. Talk about a guilt trip. But for some women, especially those from noble families who could afford the substantial donation required, convents offered an alternative to marriage. Within convent walls, women could become educated, learn to read and write, copy manuscripts, create art, study herbs and medicine, and even hold positions of authority as abbesses. Some powerful abbesses controlled vast estates and wielded significant political influence, though always within the strict hierarchy of the church, where they remained subordinate to male bishops. The religious life wasn't easy: strict rules, communal living, vows of poverty, chastity and obedience. But for women seeking education or escape from unwanted marriages, it represented one of the few socially acceptable alternatives to being a wife and mother. It's telling that many women chose what was essentially a lifetime of celibacy and restriction over marriage. When permanent confinement with nuns sounds like the better option, you know marriage must have been pretty grim. Life in a convent wasn't just about avoiding marriage. For some women, it was an intellectual oasis in a desert of enforced ignorance. Behind those austere walls, nuns created some of the most impressive works of medieval art, literature and music that we've never given them proper credit for. Take Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess who casually composed music, wrote medical texts, invented her own language, and corresponded with popes and emperors while having visions that today's neurologists think might have been migraines. She was basically running a medieval girl boss empire while most women couldn't even sign their own names. The daily routine in a convent was rigorous. Prayers 8 times a day starting at 2 a.m. Simple meals eaten in silence, hours of labour in gardens or scriptoriums, and strict rules about, well, everything. But compared to being a broodmare who also functions as a servant, it looked pretty appealing to many educated women. Convents also served as the medieval equivalent of nursing homes, orphanages, hospitals, and women's shelters all rolled into one. Inconvenient widow? Send her to a convent. Unmarriageable daughter with a facial disfigurement? Convent. Noblewoman who survived a political purge and needs to disappear? You guessed it. Convent. These institutions took in women society had no other place for, giving them purpose and community when the alternative was often destitution. Of course, not all women entered willingly. Parents forced rebellious daughters into convents, and husbands occasionally packed off wives who'd displeased them. Imagine being trapped for life because you talked back one too many times. For these unwilling nuns, the convent was just another prison, albeit one with better library access than most. Not everyone lived in a convent though, and for ordinary women, village social life offered rare moments of respite from endless labour. The village well wasn't just where you hauled water, it was medieval social media, the place where women gathered to exchange news, gossip, advice and support, while performing the daily chore of water collection. These female networks were crucial survival mechanisms. From them, you'd learn which midwife had the best record for difficult births, which herbs actually worked for colic, and which priest would look the other way if you needed to work during a holy day because your family was starving. You'd also learn which men to avoid, which mothers-in-law were cruel to their sons' wives, and which families might have a surplus of food they'd share if your harvest failed. Women relied on each other because, frankly, no one else was going to help them. These informal support systems functioned as childcare co-ops, healthcare providers, employment agencies, and therapists all in one. Your female neighbours might help with your birth, watch your children while you worked, teach you skills, lend you necessities, and eventually prepare your body for burial. But this solidarity had its dark side. The same gossip networks that supported women could destroy them. Accusations of immoral behaviour, witchcraft, or simply being different could spread like wildfire, turning yesterday's friend into today's outcast. Women enforced patriarchal norms on each other, sometimes more strictly than men did, because when your survival depends on the system, you become invested in maintaining it, even when it harms you. One bright spot in many women's lives was market day, a rare opportunity to leave the confines of home and participate in the wider world. Markets were chaotic, colourful affairs where peasants, craftspeople, and merchants gathered to buy, sell, and trade everything from livestock to textiles to spices. For women, markets represented one of the few socially acceptable spaces where they could engage in commerce somewhat independently. You might sell surplus eggs from your chickens, cheese from your goats, ale you'd brewed, or cloth you'd woven. That precious income was often the only money you controlled directly, and you guarded it fiercely. Market day was also a chance to obtain necessities your household couldn't produce. Salt for preserving food, metal needles that would make your sewing less torturous, perhaps a trinket for a child or a small luxury like a ribbon for yourself. These tiny indulgences were rare bright spots in a life of unrelenting work. The marketplace was a uniquely gender-integrated space where women could exercise a degree of public authority that was denied them elsewhere. Female brewers, bakers and textile workers might run thriving businesses, train apprentices, and gain modest economic independence. These women walked a precarious line, successful enough to support themselves but careful not to become too successful and attract negative attention from male competitors or authorities. And success in business came with its own dangers. A woman too good at brewing ale might be accused of using witchcraft rather than skill. A widow whose cheese sold better than her male neighbours might find herself facing trumped-up charges of adultery or inappropriate behaviour. The same economic activities that could save you from destitution could also make you a target. It was basically a medieval catch-22. Not all women faced identical challenges. Your experience varied dramatically, depending on whether you lived in the countryside or in an urban centre. Rural women generally worked in family-based agriculture, tending gardens, caring for livestock, processing milk into cheese and butter, preserving foods, and helping with planting and harvests. The rural woman's workload was backbreaking but somewhat predictable, following the natural rhythms of seasons and daylight. Her social world was limited to her village, where everyone knew everyone else's business. Privacy was non-existent, but so was anonymity. You couldn't easily reinvent yourself, but you also couldn't disappear without someone noticing. Urban women, by contrast, had more diverse economic opportunities, but faced different dangers. Cities offered possibilities for specialised trades, from silk weaving to pastry making to running taverns or inns. Guilds occasionally admitted women, particularly widows continuing their husbands' businesses, though usually with restrictions that prevented them from advancing to master status. Cities also brought greater exposure to ideas, fashions and cultural changes. Urban women might encounter books, theatre and visitors from distant lands, experiences rural women could only dream of. But cities also meant crowding, disease, crime and anonymity that could be both liberating and terrifying. For the urban poor, life was particularly brutal. While rural poverty meant hunger and hardship, urban poverty often meant prostitution, one of the few options available to women without family support or marketable skills. Medieval cities had designated red light districts where women sold their bodies under conditions ranging from relatively independent work to what we'd now recognise as sex trafficking. Some cities even had municipally run brothels, regulating women's bodies as public utilities. Whether rural or urban, all women existed within rigid social hierarchies that limited their options based not just on gender, but on the socio-economic status they were born into. A noblewoman might never haul water or spin wool, but she had her own golden cage of restrictions and expectations, and without modern social mobility, the circumstances of your birth generally determined the circumstances of your death. The daughter of a peasant rarely became anything but a peasant herself, no matter how intelligent or ambitious she might be. You might think noblewomen had it made. Fancy dresses, servants doing the dirty work, actual chairs to sit on instead of three-legged stools. And sure, they didn't have to haul water or empty chamber pots themselves. But noble life came with its own special brand of misery that traded physical hardship for political pawning and gilded cages. Noble women were essentially walking, talking diplomatic treaties. Your marriage wasn't just a family alliance. It could determine the fate of entire regions. The pressure was immense. Imagine being 12 years old and knowing your behaviour could start or prevent a war. No pressure, little lady whoever you are. While peasant girls might at least know their future husbands from the village, noble girls were frequently shipped off to foreign courts where they didn't speak the language, didn't know the customs, and were completely isolated from everyone familiar. Picture being sent alone to a strange country at age 13 to marry a 40-year-old man you've never met, with only a couple of servants from home. Your homesickness doesn't matter. Your fear doesn't matter. All that matters is securing that alliance, and above all else, producing male heirs. The surveillance was constant. Unlike peasant women who might steal private moments while gathering herbs in the woods, noble ladies were watched constantly. Your ladies-in-waiting weren't just servants. They were spies reporting back to your husband, your father, or your father-in-law. Every conversation, every letter, every glance at a handsome knight was noted and potentially used against you, and that famous courtly love from the troubadours' songs, pure fiction designed to make everyone feel better about loveless political marriages. A nobleman might compose passionate verses to his lady-love, but he was still expecting his actual wife to be perfectly chaste, while bearing a new child every year until her body gave out. Medieval romance was about as realistic as those Instagram couples who post perfect sunset photos while their relationship is actually a dumpster fire. Let's talk about widowhood, the medieval woman's version of finally getting the remote control after decades of watching someone else's terrible shows. For many women, becoming a widow was the first time they experienced any real autonomy. Suddenly, you might control property, make your own decisions, and even, gasp, choose whether to remarry. The catch? Surviving long enough to become a widow wasn't easy, with men typically marrying in their late 20s or 30s, and women in their teens. Many wives outlived their husbands simply due to the age gap. Add in wars, tournaments, hunting accidents, and all the creative ways medieval men found to die, and widowhood became surprisingly common. For noble widows, this could mean substantial power. The widow's dower, typically 1/3 of her husband's estate, gave her independent income. Some powerful widows managed vast holdings, engaged in politics, commissioned art and architecture, and essentially lived their best lives after their husbands, conveniently shuffled off this mortal coil. Merchant widows often continued their husbands' businesses, sometimes with remarkable success. Guild regulations that normally excluded women frequently made exceptions for widows, allowing them to maintain workshops and train apprentices. Many such women became respected figures in their communities, though they always walked a fine line between acceptable independence and threatening the male order. For peasant widows, the reality was harsher. Without a husband's labour, maintaining a farm became nearly impossible. Many faced destitution unless they had adult sons to help, or could secure another marriage quickly. The desperate remarriage of older widows to much younger men was common enough to appear regularly in medieval literature, usually as an object of mockery because medieval comedy was just as cruel as medieval everything else. The worst part, this precarious independence could end at any moment if male relatives or local authorities decided a widow had too much freedom or property. Many were pressured into remarrying, often to men chosen by the same family members who'd picked their first husbands. The brief taste of autonomy made returning to subjugation all the more bitter. Now for one of the darkest aspects of medieval womanhood, witchcraft accusations. While the major witch hunts came later in the early modern period, the foundations were laid firmly in medieval attitudes toward women, especially those who didn't fit neatly into approved roles. Who was most likely to be accused of the witchcraft? The weird women. The ones who lived alone, knew too much about herbs, helped with births but couldn't have their own children, spoke out of turn, or just looked at someone the wrong way on a day when their cow happened to die. Basically, any woman who made men uncomfortable might find herself facing accusations. The older widow who didn't remarry? Witch. The midwife whose patient died in childbirth despite her best efforts? Witch. The woman who knew which plants eased pain or induced abortion? Definitely a witch. The one who inherited property men wanted? Suspiciously witchy. Had a better business than your male competitor? Must be using dark arts. What made witchcraft accusations so insidious was how they turned women's knowledge against them. The very skills that made a woman valuable to her community. Her understanding of herbal medicine, her ability to assist in childbirth, her knowledge of livestock care could be reframed as evidence of consorting with the devil. It was a textbook no-win situation, and once accused, good luck defending yourself. The tests for witchcraft were designed for failure. Throw her in water, if she floats she's a witch. If she sinks and drowns, oops, guess she was innocent after all. Too bad she's dead. Find a witch's mark on her body, which could be anything from a mole to a birthmark to a scar. Torture her until she confesses, because everyone tells the truth when being tortured, right? The witch hysteria revealed the deep-seated fear of female power and knowledge that ran through medieval society. A woman who stepped outside her designated role, who knew too much, who lived too independently. She threatened the entire social order and had to be eliminated, usually in spectacularly cruel fashion. Speaking of cruelty, women in medieval Europe faced violence as a constant backdrop to their lives, with almost no legal protection. Domestic violence wasn't just permitted, it was expected as a normal part of maintaining household discipline. The rule of thumb, that supposedly limited wife-beating to switches no thicker than a thumb, still tells you everything you need to know about how normalised such violence was. A husband had broad legal rights to correct his wife through physical force. Church authorities might occasionally intervene in extreme cases, but only if the violence was excessive by medieval standards, which were, to put it mildly, different from ours. When severe bruising and broken bones were considered acceptable disciplinary methods, you can imagine what counted as excessive. For peasant women, the dangers extended beyond the home. Working in fields or travelling to markets left women vulnerable to assault, with little recourse if attacked. During times of war, which was basically always somewhere in medieval Europe, women were considered legitimate targets, with rape used as a weapon of war and a spoil of conquest. Urban women faced their own dangers. City streets were poorly lit, poorly policed, and rife with violence. Working as servants in wealthy households exposed young women to predatory masters with almost unlimited power over them. Brothel workers faced violence as an occupational hazard, with few legal protections. The legal system itself offered little protection. A woman's testimony carried less weight than a man's, making convictions for violence against women rare. Rape was technically a crime, but it was treated primarily as a property offence against the woman's male guardian, rather than as a crime against the woman herself. Proving rape required multiple witnesses or visible injuries, and even then a woman's reputation could undermine her case. Few options existed for escaping violent situations. There were no shelters, no restraining orders, no supportive services. The best an abused woman might hope for was intervention from family members, or in rare cases, separation approved by church authorities, though this usually left her economically vulnerable and socially stigmatized. The most shocking aspect for modern viewers? How thoroughly violence against women was woven into the fabric of medieval society, in law, in religion, in daily practice, and how completely this violence was justified by the belief in women's inherent inferiority and need for control. When an entire culture views half its population as flawed by design, violence becomes not just common but logical. A chilling example of how beliefs shape behaviours across societies. Let's talk about aging in a time when getting old was both a miracle and a curse. If you managed to survive childbirth, accidents, disease, famine and violence long enough to reach menopause, congratulations, you've outlived most of your contemporaries. The average medieval woman who made it past childhood might live to about 45 to 50, though some certainly lived much longer. Menopause brought mixed blessings. On one hand, you were finally free from the constant cycle of pregnancy and childbirth that had dominated your adult life. On the other hand, your culture now viewed you with a mixture of suspicion and dismissal. Your reproductive value was gone, and in a society that prized women primarily as baby makers, that was a problem. Physical changes came without any medical support or even basic understanding. Hot flashes must be possessed by something. Mood swings, definitely a sign of moral weakness or demonic influence. Vaginal dryness. Don't even think about mentioning that to anyone unless you want to be branded as unchaste for even acknowledging such things. The postmenopausal woman occupied a strange social space. No longer young enough to be desirable, but experienced enough to be useful, older women often became repositories of practical knowledge. Midwifery, herbal medicine, textile crafts, food preservation techniques. This knowledge gave them a certain status, especially among other women, but also made them targets for suspicion, as we discussed with witch hunts. Your appearance in old age told the story of your hard life. Without dental care, you were likely missing teeth. Without proper nutrition, your bones might be bent from rickets or osteoporosis. Your hands would be gnarled from decades of labour, your skin weathered from sun exposure, your eyes possibly clouded by cataracts with no treatment available. There was no moisturiser, no reading glasses, no dentures, no hip replacements, just the accumulated wear and tear of a brutally physical life. If you were lucky, adult children cared for you when you could no longer work. If not, you faced few options. There were no retirement homes, no social security, no safety net beyond family and community charity. Elderly women without support often ended up as beggars, or in almshouses run by religious orders, where conditions range from barely adequate to actively horrifying. The medieval view of aging women was remarkably contradictory. The same woman might be respected as a grandmother and midwife within her family circle, while being feared as a potential witch by outsiders. The same wrinkles that marked her as wise to some marked her as suspicious to others. It was yet another impossible standard for women to navigate. Age brought both potential authority and potential danger. After a life of endless work, constant danger and strict limitations, death finally offered medieval women equality with men, at least in theory. Everyone died, everyone faced judgment, and everyone's soul was supposedly valued equally by God. In practice, even death and burial practices reflected gender disparities. Preparation for death was a community affair, primarily managed by women. Female relatives and neighbours washed the body, stuffed its orifices with herbs to slow decomposition, dressed it in a simple shroud, and laid it out for viewing. This intimate care of the dead was one of women's many invisible but essential social functions. The good death in medieval culture meant dying at home, surrounded by family, having received last rites from a priest. While men might die violently in battle or accidents, women more commonly died from childbirth complications, disease, or simply being worn down by decades of grueling labour. Each type of death carried different implications for the soul's journey. Your funeral reflected your social status. A noblewoman might receive an elaborate ceremony with expensive tomb effigies. A merchant's wife might get a decent burial with prayers said for her soul. A peasant woman would likely have a simple burial in the churchyard, perhaps with a wooden marker that would rot away within a generation, leaving her grave anonymous. Memorial practices also reflected gender differences. Men's tombs and memorials often highlighted their accomplishments, titles, and public roles. Women's primarily identified them through their relationships to men, wife of, daughter of, mother of. Even in death, women were defined by their connection to the men in their lives rather than by their own identities. After death, your soul's fate depended partly on prayers said for you by the living. This created another gender disparity. Men were more likely to have funds set aside for memorial masses, chantry priests dedicated to praying for their souls, or entries in monastery prayer books. Women's spiritual aftercare was typically less elaborate, unless they were of very high status, potentially extending gender inequality beyond the grave and into purgatory itself. Now, lest you think medieval Europe was a complete nightmare for every single woman, let's acknowledge some notable exceptions. Women who managed to carve out remarkable lives despite all the restrictions we've discussed. Eleanor of Aquitaine defied all the rules. Twice-married queen, crusader, cultural patron, political schemer who led a rebellion against her own husband, and mother to multiple kings, Eleanor wielded power with skill that would impress Machiavelli. She lived to be 82 in an era when most people died in their 40s, outlasting most of her male contemporaries and manipulating European politics for decades. Christine de Pizan became Europe's first professional female writer in the early 15th century. Widowed young with children to support, she turned her exceptional education into a career writing poetry, philosophy and political works, including the Book of the City of Ladies, which directly challenged misogynistic attitudes. In an age before feminism had a name, Christine was systematically dismantling arguments about women's inferiority and creating space for female intellectual achievement. Marjorie Kempe, mystic, mother of 14 children, business owner, and general medieval troublemaker, dictated what's considered the first autobiography in English. Unable to write, she narrated her spiritual experiences, travels, and daily life to scribes. Church authorities repeatedly tried to silence or control her, but Marjorie kept right on having visions, undertaking pilgrimages, and speaking her mind with remarkable persistence. Trutta of Salerno practiced and taught medicine at the prestigious Salerno Medical School in 12th century Italy. Her writings on women's health incorporated practical experience, rather than just repeating classical authorities, making her work uniquely valuable. In an era when formal medical practice was increasingly closed to women, Trota found ways to preserve and share her knowledge. These exceptions are important not just as inspirational stories, but as evidence that the systems oppressing women were never entirely successful. Even in the most restrictive environments, women found ways to resist, to create, to lead, and to leave their mark. Their exceptionalism highlights both the barriers most women faced and the remarkable determination required to overcome them. Despite overwhelming obstacles, medieval women's contributions shaped their world in ways both recognised and unrecognised. The textile industry, one of medieval Europe's economic powerhouses, depended entirely on female labour. Those gorgeous tapestries in modern museums, made by women whose names we'll never know, the exquisite embroidery on ecclesiastical garments, female handiwork, the ale that everyone drank instead of water, brewed by women until commercial brewing became profitable enough for men to take over. Women's economic contributions extended far beyond the household. They worked as merchants, innkeepers, bakers, brewers, midwives, wet nurses, seamstresses, spinners, weavers, laundresses, and in countless other occupations. Urban tax records show women running businesses, owning property, and participating in guilds despite formal restrictions. In rural areas, women's agricultural labour was essential to survival. They managed dairy production, kept kitchen gardens that provided crucial nutrition, preserved foods that sustained families through winter, and stepped in to handle traditionally male tasks when needed during wars or other crises. The medieval peasant economy simply could not have functioned without women's constant work. Women's intellectual contributions, though less documented, were equally significant. Female scribes copied manuscripts, preserving knowledge through the Dark Ages. Noble women patronised arts and literature, shaping cultural development. Nuns created illuminated manuscripts, composed music, and maintained educational traditions when secular education collapsed during the early medieval period. Perhaps most importantly, women were the primary transmitters of practical knowledge. Medical care, food preparation, textile production, childcare techniques, herbal remedies, and innumerable other skills passed from mother to daughter across generations. This unwritten wisdom kept communities alive through plagues, famines, and wars, when formal, male-dominated institutions failed. The medieval world was built on women's labour, knowledge, and resilience, even as it simultaneously devalued and restricted them. Their contributions weren't separate from or additional to medieval society. They were foundational to it. Without women's constant, unacknowledged work, the cathedrals wouldn't have been built, the manuscripts wouldn't have been preserved, the children wouldn't have survived, and the entire economic and social system would have collapsed. The greatest legacy of medieval women may be simply that they endured, finding ways to live, love, create, and resist within systems designed to limit them at every turn. When we look at the restrictions they faced, the question isn't, why weren't there more exceptional women in the Middle Ages? But rather, how did any women manage to leave their mark at all? The answer lies in their extraordinary resilience, creativity, and determination to carve out whatever small spaces for agency they could find within their constrained world. Looking back across the centuries, what's most striking isn't just how difficult medieval women's lives were, though they were undeniably brutal by modern standards, but how their struggles connect to patterns we can still recognise today. The medieval world didn't invent misogyny, but it certainly perfected some of its most enduring forms, creating templates for gender inequality that echo through history right up to the present. Take the double standards around sexuality, which judged women's moral character by their sexual behaviour, while giving men far more latitude, or the economic devaluation of women's work, treating labour traditionally done by women as less important despite its essential nature, or the way women's bodies were simultaneously objectified and regulated, with rules imposed by those who had never experienced female embodiment, or the persistent belief that women were intellectually inferior, justifying their exclusion from education and positions of authority. These patterns didn't disappear with the Middle Ages. They evolved, adapted, and in some cases disguised themselves in more palatable forms, but their essential structure remained. When we see debates about reproductive rights, workplace discrimination, or representation in leadership positions today, we're witnessing modern versions of conflicts that medieval women would have recognised immediately. The medical myths about women's bodies that seemed so absurd, wandering wombs and medical treatments based on superstition rather than evidence, have modern parallels in healthcare disparities and the dismissal of women's pain. The witch hunts that targeted independent or unconventional women find echoes in the harassment of women who challenge norms or speak out in male-dominated spaces. Even the tension between women's essential economic contributions and their limited legal recognition continues in discussions about unpaid domestic labour, the gender pay gap, and the undervaluation of caring professions predominantly staffed by women. Medieval society couldn't have functioned without women's labour, yet systematically denied them appropriate compensation, authority, or recognition, a contradiction that remains unresolved. By understanding these connections, we gain perspective not just on how far we've come, which is substantial, but on how persistent these patterns are, how deeply rooted in cultural assumptions about gender that span centuries. The medieval woman struggling against limitations imposed by her society isn't just a distant historical curiosity. She's part of the same story we're still writing today. So what do we take away from this journey through the dark and difficult world of medieval womanhood? Perhaps it's an appreciation for the modern conveniences and rights we take for granted. Indoor plumbing alone is worth a moment of gratitude. Perhaps it's a sobering recognition of how recently many of these injustices were considered normal, and how vigilant we need to be against their return in new forms. Or perhaps it's simply awe at the resilience of women who endured unimaginable hardships while still finding ways to love, create, and occasionally rebel. As we wrap up tonight's exploration of medieval women's lives, I want to leave you with this thought. History isn't just about kings and battles and grand political movements. It's about ordinary people navigating the circumstances they were born into, finding meaning and connection despite limitations we can barely imagine today. The medieval women we've discussed tonight, from queens to peasants, from nuns to midwives, were incredibly constrained by their society. Yet they weren't merely passive victims of their circumstances. They found agency where they could, carved out spaces for themselves within restrictive structures, passed knowledge to one another through networks that men often couldn't see or understand, and occasionally broke through barriers entirely. Their persistence in the face of overwhelming obstacles is what allowed change to eventually happen, even if most of them didn't live to see it. The next time you use birth control, own property in your name, choose your own partner, vote, get an education, practice a profession, or make decisions about your own body, remember that these rights weren't inevitable. They were won through centuries of women pushing boundaries, questioning assumptions, and refusing to accept that their humanity was somehow less valuable than men's. The freedoms we enjoy today were built on their foundations, through their quiet resistance and occasional loud defiance. Imagine England in 1485, not the postcard version with thatched cottages and quaint village greens, but a kingdom ripped apart by 3 decades of noble families, beating each other senseless with swords. Welcome to the Wars of the Roses, where the houses of York and Lancaster, 2 branches of the same royal family, decided that sharing was overrated and killing each other was much more fun. Picture this. Nobles switching sides faster than teenagers changed their Instagram bios, battles where fathers fought sons, and a royal musical chairs so chaotic that England had 3 different kings in the same year. Twice. The crown bounced between heads like a hot potato nobody wanted to hold, but everyone was willing to murder for. By 1483, the Yorkist King Edward IV has just dropped dead unexpectedly. Not ideal timing. His heir, a 12-year-old boy now known as Edward V, who'd barely finished breakfast before his Uncle Richard decided nephew was just another word for obstacle, and locked the kid in the Tower of London along with his little brother. Both princes mysteriously vanished, and Uncle Richard became Richard III. The country was exhausted, the nobility decimated, the treasury empty. Common folks were just trying not to starve while aristocrats played their deadly game of thrones. England needed stability like a medieval peasant needed a bath, desperately and immediately. And that's when a nobody, well, a Welsh nobody, with the thinnest royal claim imaginable, sailed in from exile in France with an army smaller than a modern high school marching band. His name, Henry Tudor. And against all odds, he was about to change England forever. Henry Tudor should never have been king. His claim to the throne was laughably weak through his mother from an illegitimate line of John of Gaunt. Basically, if you lined up everyone with royal blood in 1485, Henry would have been standing somewhere near the back, possibly serving drinks. But here's the thing about the Wars of the Roses. It had already killed most of the people ahead of him in line. This Welsh nobody grew up in exile, hiding from Yorkist assassins raised by an uncle in Brittany. Henry was more survivor than warrior, cautious, calculating, and chronically suspicious. Not exactly the stuff of legends. No flowing golden locks or booming battlefield voice. Just a skinny, serious man with the charisma of a tax collector and the face of someone who just smelled something unpleasant. Yet somehow, this underwhelming figure landed in Wales with just 2,000 men, most of them French mercenaries who probably couldn't point to England on a map. As he marched inland, disgruntled nobles joined him, less because they loved Henry, and more because they really, really hated Richard III. The 2 armies met at Bosworth Field on August 22nd, 1485. Richard III actually outnumbered Henry's forces, and might have won except for one tiny detail. Half his army decided mid-battle that actually, they'd rather not fight for him after all. Oops. Richard, to his credit, didn't go down easily. He charged directly at Henry in a last-ditch suicide mission, killed Henry's standard-bearer, and nearly reached Tudor himself before being surrounded and hacked to death. The crown Richard wore into battle allegedly fell off his head and rolled under a hawthorn bush, a gift-wrapped metaphor for the history books. Henry VII knew his grasp on the crown was about as secure as a drunk man riding a bull. His first brilliant move? Marry Elizabeth of York, daughter of the late King Edward IV. This wasn't just any political marriage, it was the medieval equivalent of a corporate merger between Coke and Pepsi after decades of cutthroat competition. Henry wasted no time. He proposed before even reaching London, was crowned first, he wasn't taking any chances, then married her in January 1486. The message was clear. The Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York were now one family, symbolised by the Tudor rose, a neat little visual propaganda tool showing the red and white flowers combined. Did they love each other? Who knows? Did it matter? Not really. What mattered was that Elizabeth was gorgeous, fertile, and crucially a York. Together they were marketing genius. Henry got legitimacy. Elizabeth got to be queen instead of a political prisoner. Win-win. The Tudor PR machine worked overtime. Royal ceremonies showcased the happy couple. The Tudor rose appeared everywhere, from tapestries to coins. Their first son, Arthur, arrived just 8 months after the wedding. Doing the math, let's just say the royal honeymoon started early. More children followed. Margaret, Henry, Elizabeth, Mary, Edmund, Catherine, though not all survived childhood, because being a royal baby in Tudor England was still more dangerous than playing hopscotch in a minefield. Behind closed doors, Henry kept the royal treasury and decision-making firmly in his own hands. Elizabeth might have been essential for his image, but this was no power-sharing arrangement. She played her part perfectly, beautiful, dignified, fertile, and never ever challenging her husband's authority in public. Being king is hard when people keep showing up claiming they're the real king. Henry VII barely had time to try on different crown angles before the pretenders started crawling out of the woodwork. First came Lambert Simnel in 1487, a baker's boy who was coached to pretend he was Edward, Earl of Warwick, a real Yorkist heir Henry had locked in the Tower. Lambert attracted an army of Irish supporters and German mercenaries, proving that people will back literally anyone if they dislike the current government enough. Henry crushed the rebellion at the Battle of Stoke Field, then, in a surprisingly chill move, pardoned Lambert and gave him a job as a kitchen servant. Nothing says, "I'm the legitimate king," like having the guy who tried to usurp you turning your meat spits. Next came Perkin Warbeck, a more persistent problem who claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, one of those princes who disappeared in the Tower. Perkin spent nearly 8 years causing trouble, backed at various times by the French, Scots and Holy Roman Emperor. He even invaded with a tiny army in 1497, got as far as Exeter, then immediately surrendered when Henry's real army showed up. Henry initially spared Warbeck too, but after the pretender tried to escape and then got mixed up in another plot, the king's patience evaporated faster than ale at a peasant wedding. Warbeck was hanged in 1499, along with the real Earl of Warwick, who'd done nothing except exist with Yorkist blood. The message was clear. Henry Tudor, once the unlikely outsider, was now firmly in charge. Cross him, and your head would end up having a very uncomfortable meeting with the Tower's decorative spikes. The Tudor dynasty was here to stay, at least for now. While other kings were busy swinging swords and bedding mistresses, Henry VII was hunched over account books with the enthusiasm of an accountant who'd just discovered a new spreadsheet formula. Turns out the most revolutionary thing this king did was paperwork. Henry created a financial system so effective it was downright terrifying. He established the council learned in the law, basically a squad of legal hitmen who found creative ways to extract cash from nobles through bonds, recognisances and fines. Fall out of favour with the king? That'll be £10,000, please. Planning a rebellion? Make it 20,000. Just existing while rich? There's definitely a fee for that. His two chief enforcers, Richard Empson and Edmund Dudley, became the most hated men in England. Imagine medieval versions of those parking attendants who ticket you seconds after your meter expires. They were so ruthlessly efficient that Henry's son would eventually execute them just to win popularity points. The king revolutionised customs collection, personally signed off on household expenses, and kept meticulous records of every penny. He turned the royal chamber into a personal bank, bypassing the traditional exchequer. This wasn't just penny pinching, it was strategic genius that transformed the monarchy from a military institution to an administrative one. By his death in 1509, Henry had amassed a fortune of £1.25 million, billions in today's money, all without imposing unpopular taxes that might cause rebellions. The nobles were poorer, the crown was richer, and England had unwittingly stepped into the modern era of state bureaucracy. Not exactly the stuff of swashbuckling legends, but Henry didn't care about legends. He cared about results. And his greatest result, stability through boring administrative excellence, gave his son the freedom to be the flashy, larger-than-life king that Henry never could be. When young Henry VIII took the throne in 1509, England collectively gasped like teenagers seeing their favourite boy band. At 17, he was 6 feet tall, athletic, with flowing red-gold hair and a face that launched 1,000 royal portraits. After decades of his father's grim penny pinching, Henry VIII was like a human party waiting to happen. This wasn't just any prince. This was a Renaissance man on steroids. He spoke Latin, French and Spanish fluently. He could debate theology with scholars, compose music that's still performed today, dance like nobody's business, and throw a javelin farther than his professional soldiers. When he wasn't busy governing, he was jousting, hawking, hunting, wrestling or playing tennis in tight-fitting outfits specifically designed to show off his muscular calves. The Tudor equivalent of an Instagram thirst trap. Henry immediately started spending Daddy's carefully hoarded fortune like a lottery winner on a bender. Out went his father's calculating advisors, straight to the executioner actually, and in came the entertainers, artists and yes men. The court transformed overnight from a glorified accounting office to a 24/7 spectacle of tournaments, feasts and pageants. But beneath the partying and peacocking, young Henry had imperial ambitions. He dreamed of being a warrior king like Henry V, conqueror of France. He wanted glory, fame and his name in the history books, not for his administrative talents, but for battlefield victories and kingly splendour. What nobody realised yet was that behind the charming smile and impressive codpiece lurked something more dangerous. An intelligent, willful man with unlimited power, a fragile ego, and a growing conviction that God personally approved of everything he wanted to do. England was about to discover just how expensive a king's midlife crisis could be. Before she became the discarded wife, Catherine of Aragon was England's beloved warrior queen. Arriving from Spain at 16 to marry Henry's older brother Arthur, she barely had time to unpack before he inconveniently died. For 7 years, she was stranded in England, too valuable to send home, too expensive to maintain properly, stuck in diplomatic limbo while Henry VII and her father haggled over her dowry like merchants arguing over a damaged shipment. When young Henry VIII came to the throne, he married Catherine in what seemed like the medieval version of a Hollywood romance. She was 23, beautiful, accomplished, and, crucially, certified virgin royalty with prime diplomatic connections. Henry was genuinely smitten, writing her love letters signed with little hearts. Seriously, look them up. While Henry played at being king, Catherine proved herself a formidable queen. In 1513, when Henry swanned off to France for a war holiday, he left Catherine as regent. Scotland promptly invaded, because nothing says opportunistic like attacking while the king's away. Catherine responded by rallying troops, riding north heavily pregnant, delivering a rousing speech while wearing armour, and coordinating the massive English victory at Flodden Field that left the Scottish king and most of his nobility dead on the battlefield. She sent pieces of the Scottish king's bloody coat to Henry as a trophy, essentially out-kinged the king. For nearly 20 years she was the perfect queen, dignified, popular, diplomatic, and clever. She gave birth to a surviving daughter, Mary, but no son survived infancy. As Catherine aged, Henry's eye wandered, and that missing male heir became an obsession. The woman who once commanded armies found herself facing a different battle, one against a husband determined to discard her, a battle even a warrior queen couldn't win. Thomas Wolsey wasn't born to power. He clawed his way into it with fingernails bitten to the quick. The son of an Ipswich butcher, a fact his enemies never let him forget, Wolsey rose through sheer brilliance, work ethic, and an uncanny ability to make himself indispensable to the young Henry VIII. By 1515, this commoner had become Lord Chancellor of England and a cardinal of the Catholic Church, living more lavishly than most princes. Imagine a medieval Elon Musk, but with better taste and red robes. Wolsey built Hampton Court Palace before gifting it to Henry, the 16th century equivalent of "my mansion is getting boring, want it?" His household had over 500 servants. He ate off solid gold plates while lesser nobles had to make do with mere silver. But Wolsey's true genius was administrative. He modernised the legal system, created efficient taxation, and ran the country while Henry hunted, jousted, and composed love songs. He even controlled access to the king. If you wanted something from Henry, you went through Wolsey first, preferably with your purse open. On the international stage, Wolsey manoeuvred England into a position of influence far beyond its actual power, playing the Holy Roman Emperor and French King against each other. He seriously pursued becoming Pope twice, while simultaneously running England, because apparently being the second most powerful man in one country wasn't enough for his boundless ambition. For 15 years, Wolsey was effectively the CEO of England, with Henry as the charismatic but hands-off chairman. The arrangement worked perfectly until Henry wanted something Wolsey couldn't deliver: a divorce from Catherine of Aragon. Suddenly, the man who had solved every royal problem found himself facing an impossible task, with a king whose patience was running dangerously thin. By 1527, Henry VIII had a problem. A sexy, complicated, history-altering problem named Anne Boleyn. After nearly 20 years of marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Henry's wandering eye had fixed on a sharp-tongued brunette with magnetic charm and zero interest in becoming just another royal mistress. Unlike her sister Mary, yes, Henry had already bedded her, Anne refused to hop into the royal bed without a wedding ring. And thus began what Henry euphemistically called his great matter, his desperate quest for a divorce that would reshape England forever. On paper, Henry's reasoning seemed practical. Catherine had produced no surviving sons. England needed a male heir, and clearly God was displeased with their union. The real reason, of course, was that Henry was obsessed with Anne, writing her love letters so steamy they'd make a romance novelist blush. In one, he literally offered to be her servant if only she'd give herself body and heart to me. The King of England, begging. The divorce should have been simple. Popes had annulled royal marriages for far flimsier reasons than Henry's claim that marrying his brother's widow violated biblical law. But there was a slight complication. Catherine's nephew Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, had recently sacked Rome and effectively held the Pope hostage. Awkward. For years, Henry tried every legal manoeuvre, theological argument, and diplomatic pressure tactic imaginable. Wolsey was dispatched to arrange papal approval, failed, and found himself stripped of power faster than you could say, unemployed cardinal. Henry assembled Europe's theologians to support his case, while Catherine stood her ground with legendary stubbornness, insisting her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. As the stalemate dragged on, Henry grew increasingly desperate, Anne increasingly impatient, and England increasingly confused about who exactly was running the kingdom: the king, his not-quite-girlfriend, or the foreign pope who refused to cooperate with royal bedroom plans. By 1533, Henry VIII was done playing nice. After years of papal stalling, Henry did what any reasonable person would do when denied a divorce. He declared himself head of a brand new church and told the Pope to take a flying leap into the Tiber River. This wasn't a theological revolution. Henry remained as Catholic as pasta in Italy when it came to actual beliefs. This was a power grab wrapped in religious packaging, executed with ruthless political genius. The break with Rome played out like a slow-motion corporate takeover. First, Henry assembled a compliant parliament to pass laws cutting papal authority. Then he hit the church where it hurt, the wallet, demanding the clergy recognise him as their supreme head and pay for the privilege. When the Archbishop of Canterbury conveniently died, Henry installed Thomas Cranmer, a man whose qualification was basically, "We'll do whatever Henry wants." The final pieces fell rapidly. Anne was already pregnant. Oops. So Cranmer quickly declared Henry's first marriage invalid and his second one legal. Anne was crowned queen in a lavish ceremony, while Catherine was demoted to Princess Dowager and exiled to a series of increasingly damp and miserable castles. The Pope excommunicated Henry, but England's king discovered that being told he was going to hell had remarkably little effect on his earthly power. Across England, royal agents required everyone of importance to swear oaths acknowledging royal supremacy or face unpleasant consequences ranging from job loss to head loss. Overnight, England became a bizarre hybrid, Catholic in practice but with the king replacing the Pope. Religious reformers celebrated prematurely, thinking Henry's break signalled Protestant change. They'd soon learn that Henry hadn't objected to Catholic power. He had objected to anyone's power but his own. Anne Boleyn was nobody's idea of a traditional queen. Dark where Catherine had been fair, sharp-tongued where Catherine had been diplomatic, French-educated, fashion-forward, and dangerously intelligent. She discussed theology with scholars, played politics like a chess grandmaster, and didn't bother hiding her opinions. A woman so magnetic that Henry VIII upended 1,000 years of religious tradition just to marry her. Anne's brief reign burned bright and fast. As queen, she championed religious reform, promoted educated evangelicals to high positions, and distributed banned Protestant texts. She even kept a copy of William Tyndale's forbidden English Bible in her chambers for ladies-in-waiting to read, which in Tudor terms was like running an underground revolutionary book club from the palace. But beneath the glamour lay crushing pressure. Anne's primary job, producing a male heir, became a nightmare of expectations. Her first child, Elizabeth, was a girl, though would prove more effective than any king in England's history. A miscarriage followed, then another pregnancy that ended with a stillborn boy. Henry, whose attention span for wives was shortening dramatically, began eyeing one of Anne's quieter ladies-in-waiting, Jane Seymour. Anne's enemies, and she had collected many, seized their chance. Led by Thomas Cromwell, they built an absurd case accusing her of adultery with multiple men, including her own brother. The charges were ludicrous. Anne was never alone enough to have managed such affairs, but truth was irrelevant in a rigged trial. On May 19th, 1536, the woman who had changed the course of English history knelt before a French swordsman, specially imported to give her a cleaner death than an English axe would provide. Her last words showed the dark humour that had characterised her life. I heard say the executioner was very good, and I have a little neck. If Henry VIII was Tudor England's unstable CEO, Thomas Cromwell was its ruthless chief operating officer, the man who made the impossible happen through intelligence, intimidation, and an unmatched talent for bureaucratic violence. Born to a Putney blacksmith and with no formal education, Cromwell's rise makes modern rags-to-riches stories look lazy. After a mysterious youth involving mercenary work in Italy and trading in the Netherlands, he returned to England, trained as a lawyer, and caught Cardinal Wolsey's eye. When Wolsey fell, Cromwell performed a political miracle, keeping his own head while transferring directly into royal service. As Henry's chief minister, Cromwell engineered the entire English Reformation through Parliament. Laws, proclamations, propaganda campaigns, he modernised the entire state apparatus to serve the king's whims. He didn't just execute policies, he created entirely new systems of government that centralised power in ways England had never seen. Need to break with Rome? Cromwell drafted the legislation. Need to dispose of Anne Boleyn? Cromwell assembled the completely fabricated evidence. Need to dissolve hundreds of monasteries and seize their wealth? Cromwell created an efficient bureaucratic machine that inventoried, assessed, and liquidated religious houses with assembly line precision. His methods were often brutal. Opponents found themselves facing treason charges based on laws Cromwell himself had written. He expanded the definition of treason to include merely thinking disloyal thoughts, creating a Tudor version of a surveillance state where casual comments could lead to execution. For nearly a decade, Cromwell was effectively England's chief executive, building the framework of the modern state while simultaneously destroying the institutions of medieval England. He made himself indispensable to Henry, until, like Wolsey before him, he made one crucial mistake, arranging a marriage that Henry came to regret. In 1536, Thomas Cromwell launched the greatest property grab in English history, the dissolution of the monasteries. Imagine a government deciding that Starbucks was unnecessary, seizing every location nationwide, firing all baristas, selling the buildings to wealthy developers, and pocketing the profits. Now multiply that by 1,000 and add religious trauma. England's monasteries were everywhere. Over 800 religious houses owned roughly a quarter of all cultivated land. They were hospitals, hotels, schools, welfare offices, libraries, and retirement homes rolled into one. They were also conveniently sitting on mountains of cash, land, and treasures accumulated over centuries. Cromwell's genius was packaging naked greed as moral reform. His agents toured monasteries compiling reports of monks' misbehaviour, some true, most wildly exaggerated or completely fabricated. One monastery supposedly worshipped a phony sacred blood relic that was actually duck's blood. Others were accused of housing sexually depraved monks and nuns engaged in activities that would make modern porn stars blush. The dissolution happened with assembly line efficiency. Smaller houses went first, then the larger ones. Royal commissioners arrived, took inventories, pensioned off cooperative monks and nuns, stripped out valuables, and sold the buildings and lands to eager nobles and gentry at bargain prices. The cultural destruction was staggering. Libraries containing thousands of medieval manuscripts were destroyed, stained glass was smashed, sculptures defaced, and centuries of architectural beauty reduced to quarries for building materials. Monastic treasures, gold altarpieces, jewelled reliquaries, illuminated manuscripts, were melted down or sold off. Henry got insanely rich in the process, nearly tripling the crown's landed income. But he burned through this windfall with spectacular speed, spending it on palaces, warships, and costly foreign wars. The real winners were the gentry and nobles who bought monastic lands cheaply, creating a powerful class with a vested interest in preventing any return to Catholicism. By 1536, Henry had established a disturbing pattern, marrying women, growing dissatisfied, and finding increasingly creative ways to dispose of them. His last 4 marriages played out like a darkly comic speed dating session, with progressively lower stakes. Wife number 3, Jane Seymour, the compliant one. Henry married her literally the day after Anne Boleyn's execution, her predecessor's blood barely dry on the execution block. Quiet, obedient, and strategically bland, Jane gave Henry his longed-for son Edward, then conveniently died of childbed fever before she could disappoint him. Henry genuinely mourned her, primarily because she never lived long enough to annoy him. She achieved in death what Catherine and Anne couldn't in life, being remembered as the good wife. Wife number 4, Anne of Cleves, the catalogue model. Disappointment. Henry chose her from a flattering portrait sight unseen. Tudor-era online dating at its worst. When they met, Henry found her so unappealing he called her the Flanders mare. Anne, no fool, agreed to an annulment, received a generous settlement, outlived all Henry's wives, and enjoyed a peaceful life in England as the king's beloved sister. The ultimate divorce win. Wife number 5, Catherine Howard, the tragic teenager. Barely out of adolescence when she married 49-year-old Henry, Catherine made the fatal mistake of having a past, and worse, a present. Her premarital affairs were discovered along with evidence of a current flirtation. Catherine ended up like her cousin Anne Boleyn, minus the French swordsman upgrade. Wife number 6, Catherine Parr, the intellectual survivor. Twice widowed, intelligent and reform-minded, Catherine was more qualified to rule than Henry. She wrote religious texts, unified his dysfunctional family, and skillfully navigated court politics. When religious conservatives tried to arrest her for heresy, she convinced Henry it was all a misunderstanding. She survived him, only to die in childbirth after finally marrying the man she actually loved. By his death, Henry had effectively turned wife into the most dangerous job in England, with a 50% mortality rate that made bomb disposal look like a safe career choice. In January 1547, Henry VIII finally died, his body so swollen that his coffin allegedly exploded during his funeral. England's new king was 9-year-old Edward VI, who had been raised in an all-female household and suddenly found himself surrounded by power-hungry uncles. Edward may have been a child, but he was nobody's puppet. Educated by leading humanists, He was a precocious, serious boy with strong Protestant convictions and a disturbing enthusiasm for watching heretics burn. Imagine a child prodigy who combined theological brilliance with zero empathy, basically a tiny religious fundamentalist with a crown. Edward's reign was dominated by two adult Edwards, his uncle Edward Seymour and later John Dudley. Both pushed religious reformation at lightning speed, transforming England from Henry's weird Catholic minus the Pope system into a genuinely Protestant nation. Out went Latin services, elaborate vestments, and religious images. In came English prayer books, married clergy, and whitewashed church walls. The Mass was abolished, replaced with communion services that explicitly denied Catholic doctrine. Priests became ministers, altars became tables, and elaborate rituals were replaced with lengthy sermons explaining exactly why everything your grandparents believed was wrong. Somerset's rule collapsed after peasant rebellions and economic disaster. Northumberland proved more politically savvy but equally committed to Protestantism. Young Edward enthusiastically embraced these changes, keeping a journal where he meticulously noted the executions of religious opponents with chilling detachment. As Edward approached 15, the sickly boy developed what was probably tuberculosis. Facing death, he became obsessed with preserving Protestantism. Guided by Northumberland, he bypassed his half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth, naming his Protestant cousin Lady Jane Grey as heir instead, a decision that would send the teenage Jane straight to the executioner's block after Edward's death in 1553. If religion were a theme park ride, Tudor England would have been the most extreme rollercoaster ever built, complete with unexpected drops, violent turns, and passengers being randomly flung to their deaths. Under Henry VIII, England experienced Catholic light, all the traditional beliefs but with the king instead of the Pope in charge. Some Protestant ideas seeped in around the edges, but anyone getting too enthusiastic risked being burned as a heretic. It was religious confusion at its finest, where you could be executed for being too Catholic on Monday or too Protestant on Tuesday, depending on Henry's mood. Then came Edward VI's reign, a high-speed plunge into hardcore Protestantism. Latin masses banned, saint statues smashed, elaborate ceremonies replaced with long sermons explaining why everything your parents taught you was wrong. Religious conservatives clutched their rosary beads in horror, while reformers cheered the purifying destruction of idolatry. Just as everyone was adjusting to Protestant England, Edward died, and his Catholic sister Mary seized the throne. Cue the screeching brakes and violent directional change. Mary was determined to return England to Rome's embrace, by force if necessary. Protestant leaders fled abroad, while those too slow or principled to escape faced the flames. Around 300 Protestants were burned at the stake during her 5-year reign, earning her the charming nickname Bloody Mary. The religious whiplash was especially severe for ordinary people, who had to quickly master new services, learn which beliefs were currently acceptable, and figure out whether to hide or display their religious images depending on who was in charge that week. By the time Elizabeth took the throne in 1558, the English people had been Catholic, sort of Catholic, definitely Protestant, and forcibly Catholic again, all within a single generation. The real miracle wasn't religious transformation, but that anyone still knew what to believe at all. Lady Jane Grey, brilliant, educated, and doomed from the moment a crown touched her head. Imagine being 16 years old, forced to marry a man you barely know, then suddenly told, "Surprise, you're Queen of England!" only to discover a few days later that the prize includes a one-way ticket to the executioner's block. Talk about the worst Sweet 16 ever. Jane was the ultimate political pawn, a great-granddaughter of Henry VII with impressive Tudor blood but lacking the inconvenient male preference primogeniture problem of actually being next in line. She was also conveniently Protestant, unlike the decidedly Catholic Princess Mary waiting in the wings. As Edward VI lay dying in 1553, his regent John Dudley, motivated equally by religious conviction and naked self-interest, orchestrated the perfect storm. He married his son to Jane, convinced Edward to name her as heir, and kept Edward's death secret while positioning Jane for power. For 9 brief days, Jane was Queen of England, She reportedly wept when the crown was placed on her head, already suspecting this royal promotion might be a death sentence. She was right. Mary Tudor quickly rallied support, marched on London and seized power while Jane was still figuring out the palace floor plan. Jane was imprisoned in the Tower, initially spared execution by a surprisingly merciful Mary. But when Jane's father foolishly joined a Protestant rebellion months later, Mary's clemency evaporated. On February 12, 1554, the teenage queen who barely was climbed the scaffold. Her execution showcased the scholar she was. She recited the 51st Psalm in English and went to her death with dignity that belied her youth. Her final words to the executioner revealed both her terror and courage. "Will you take it off before I lay me down?" Followed by, "I pray you dispatch me quickly." Jane's brief life serves as Tudor England's most tragic footnote. A brilliant young woman sacrificed on the altar of religious politics, remembered primarily for how briefly and reluctantly she wore a crown. Mary Tudor took the throne in 1553 like an avenging angel, or vengeful demon, depending on your religious perspective. After years of watching her mother humiliated, her religion outlawed, and her legitimacy questioned, Mary ascended with a single-minded mission: make England Catholic again. The first female ruler of England since the 12th century, Mary initially enjoyed massive popular support. The people cheered as she restored Catholic services, welcomed papal authority back, and dismantled her brother's Protestant reforms faster than you can say theological whiplash. Her early reign showed genuine promise. She enforced fair taxation, reformed coinage, and balanced budgets with administrative skill inherited from her grandfather. But Mary's religious zeal quickly took centre stage. The Queen, who had experienced persecution firsthand, ironically became England's most enthusiastic persecutor. Leading Protestants were offered a simple choice: reconvert to Catholicism or become intimate with fire. Some fled abroad, others compromised. But roughly 300 stubborn souls, including former Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, chose flames over submission. These burnings seared themselves into England's collective memory. While the actual number of victims was lower than many European religious persecutions, the theatrical public nature of burning created lasting trauma. Protestant propagandists like John Fox ensured these martyrdoms would define Mary's legacy, with vivid accounts of suffering that still make for nightmarish reading. Mary's personal life proved equally disastrous. At 37, she married 27-year-old Philip of Spain, son of Emperor Charles V. The match was wildly unpopular with English subjects who feared becoming a Spanish satellite. Philip himself spent as little time in England as possible, treating his royal wife with polite indifference while she grew increasingly desperate for his affection and the heir that never came. By 1558, when Mary died after just 5 years on the throne, her dreams lay in ashes. England not truly Catholic, her marriage a failure, her throne passing to her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth, and her legacy reduced to one blood-soaked adjective: bloody. When Mary Tudor announced her engagement to Philip of Spain in 1554, England collectively lost its mind. Riots erupted, rebellions flared, Parliament begged the Queen to reconsider. Why? Because in Tudor minds, marrying Philip was like inviting a vampire into your home. Once Spain was in, England would be drained of autonomy, wealth, and Protestant blood. Philip arrived in England with Spanish grandeur that bordered on parody: a fleet of ships, mountains of luggage, and an entourage so large they practically constituted a Spanish invasion. English nobles watched in horror as Philip strutted around with his foreign court, speaking barely a word of English, and looking perpetually disappointed, like a luxury traveller who'd accidentally booked the budget hotel. The marriage agreement specifically limited Philip's power. He couldn't appoint Spaniards to English offices, couldn't drag England into Spanish wars, couldn't inherit the crown if Mary died childless, and couldn't take Mary's jewels out of the country. But these paper protections didn't ease English fears of becoming Spain's puppet state. Philip's presence triggered a xenophobic meltdown. Brawls between English and Spanish nobles became common. Londoners assaulted Spaniards in the streets. Pamphlets circulated warning that Spanish men were coming to defile English women and Spanish priests to steal English land. After a perfunctory attempt at playing devoted husband, Philip spent most of his marriage anywhere but England, returning briefly only when he needed money or troops for his continental wars. When Mary's health failed, he was conspicuously absent, already negotiating a potential marriage to her successor Elizabeth before Mary was even dead. The Spanish marriage disaster taught Elizabeth a critical lesson about English nationalism. Foreign entanglements risked popular revolt. It's no coincidence that the Virgin Queen decided remaining unmarried was preferable to repeating her sister's catastrophic international romance. Elizabeth Tudor's childhood was basically a masterclass in survival against impossible odds. Born the cherished princess, she became a bastard overnight when her father executed her mother Anne Boleyn. One day she's England's jewel, the next she's legally the Lady Elizabeth, not even allowed to be called princess anymore. While other little girls played with dolls, Elizabeth navigated a political minefield where a wrong word could mean death. Her education became her shield. By age 10, she was fluent in 6 languages and discussing theology, history and philosophy with leading scholars. Picture a precocious red-headed child translating Greek before breakfast, while calculating which courtiers might be plotting against her. Her adolescence brought new dangers. When her brother Edward ruled, she carefully presented herself as the perfect Protestant princess. When her sister Mary took over, Elizabeth performed an elaborate balancing act, attending Mass while avoiding confirming her Catholic conversion, staying visible enough to show loyalty but invisible enough to avoid suspicion. Elizabeth's biggest crisis came in 1554, when Thomas Wyatt led a rebellion against Mary's Spanish marriage. Though Elizabeth wasn't directly involved, her potential as a Protestant alternative made her dangerously suspicious. She was imprisoned in the Tower, the same place her mother had awaited execution. For 2 months she lived with daily fear of following Anne Boleyn to the block. When questioned, Elizabeth showcased the political genius that would define her reign. She provided careful, precise answers that revealed nothing incriminating while projecting innocence. Eventually moved to house arrest, she wrote desperate, flattering letters to Mary, while secretly maintaining Protestant connections. For years, Elizabeth existed in a state of perpetual danger, one false move away from execution, needing to be simultaneously forgettable and unforgettable. This crucible forged a queen who understood better than anyone that survival sometimes meant hiding one's true self behind a carefully constructed mask. When Elizabeth Tudor took the throne in November 1558, England was a disaster zone, bankrupt, religiously fractured, militarily weak, and with half the population convinced their new queen was an illegitimate heretic. The betting markets gave her reign 6 months. Tops. Elizabeth's coronation showcased her political genius before she'd made a single official decision. She processed through London streets, stopping constantly to interact with common people, accepting gifts, listening to petitions, and showing genuine charm. This wasn't just PR, it was a radical departure from Mary's Spanish-influenced formality. The message was clear: this queen was English to her core. Her first council meeting set the tone for the next 44 years. When her advisors expected a figurehead queen who'd defer to male wisdom, Elizabeth stunned them by taking active control, interrogating them about England's problems with impressive command of details. She didn't just ask questions, she demanded solutions. Elizabeth's religious settlement was a masterpiece of calculated ambiguity. Her 1559 acts of supremacy and uniformity created a Protestant church with just enough Catholic ceremony to keep conservatives happy. Services were in English, but ministers wore traditional vestments. The theology was Protestant, but many Catholic practices remained. Elizabeth demanded outward conformity while famously declaring she had no desire to make windows into men's souls. This wasn't tolerance as we understand it, more like, believe what you want privately, but publicly follow my rules. Her early reign was defined by what she didn't do. She didn't marry, didn't execute her Catholic cousin Mary Queen of Scots, didn't drag England into expensive foreign wars, and didn't purge her sister's Catholic advisors. Instead, she assembled a balanced Privy Council, rehabilitated the currency, built up defences, and carefully reconstructed England's international standing through masterful diplomacy. The woman everyone had underestimated quickly proved herself the most politically astute Tudor of them all. Elizabeth didn't just rule England, she branded it. While modern celebrities have Instagram teams, Elizabeth had the Tudor image machine, a sophisticated propaganda operation that transformed a red-headed, pock-marked woman into a living goddess. Her portraits were the ultimate Photoshop job. Court painters received strict instructions: minimise her small stature, hide the smallpox scars, emphasise her beautiful hands, and surround her with symbols of virginity, wisdom and power. The results were deliberately overwhelming. Elizabeth draped in pearls, standing on maps, holding sieves, or painted against backdrops of eyes and ears. These weren't just pretty pictures, they were political statements declaring Elizabeth more than merely human. Elizabeth understood visual drama better than any theatre director. Her public appearances became spectacular performances where every detail communicated imperial might. Her famous golden speech was delivered while literally sparkling, her dress so encrusted with jewels that witnesses claimed she blazed like the sun. Her wardrobe of over 2,000 dresses wasn't vanity but visual politics, each appearance showcasing wealth that left foreign ambassadors awestruck. The Virgin Queen narrative was her marketing masterpiece. When marriage negotiations failed, Elizabeth didn't admit defeat. She reframed perpetual virginity as spiritual marriage to England itself. "I am already bound unto a husband, which is the kingdom of England," she declared, transforming a political liability into mystical strength. This brilliant PR spin presented her childlessness not as a dynastic failure, but as selfless devotion to her people. Elizabeth understood what modern politicians know. Image isn't just vanity, it's power. By controlling her representation so completely, she created an icon so powerful that we still visualize her exactly as she wanted us to. Ageless, majestic, and slightly more than human, Mary Stuart was Elizabeth's worst nightmare. Younger, more conventionally beautiful, indisputably legitimate, and with a strong claim to the English throne through her grandmother Margaret Tudor. Where Elizabeth was calculating, Mary was impulsive. Where Elizabeth sacrificed personal happiness for political stability, Mary followed her heart straight into disaster. They were royal cousins who never met face to face, but whose fates were fatally intertwined. Mary returned to Scotland in 1561 after being raised in the French court, bringing continental sophistication to a kingdom dominated by dour Protestant reformers. Her Catholic faith immediately made her suspect, but her real problems stemmed from catastrophic judgment in men. Her second husband, Lord Darnley, was a vain, violent alcoholic who murdered her secretary David Rizzio in front of pregnant Mary, then got himself spectacularly assassinated when his house mysteriously exploded and he was found strangled in the garden. Mary then made the mind-boggling decision to marry the man widely suspected of murdering Darnley, the Earl of Bothwell, after he allegedly kidnapped and raped her. Whether this was Stockholm Syndrome or genuine affection remains debated, but politically it was suicide. The Scottish nobles rebelled, imprisoned Mary, and forced her abdication. In 1568, Mary fled to England seeking protection from her cousin Elizabeth. Instead, she got 19 years of comfortable imprisonment, while serving as a perpetual rallying point for Catholic plots. Elizabeth, caught between pragmatism and queenly solidarity, refused to execute a fellow anointed monarch despite her advisor's urgent recommendations. The final straw came with the Babington plot of 1586, when Mary was caught literally signing her approval of Elizabeth's assassination. Even then, Elizabeth hesitated, signing Mary's death warrant then claiming she never meant for it to be used. A transparent attempt to maintain plausible deniability, while eliminating her most dangerous rival. While Elizabeth cultivated her divine image at home, she unleashed hell abroad through her sea dogs, privateers who were basically pirates with royal permission slips. These captains, Drake, Hawkins, Frobisher and others, were Elizabeth's unofficial navy, economic stimulus program, and foreign policy enforcers rolled into one brutal package. Their mission was simple: raid Spanish treasure ships returning from the Americas, keep a percentage of the loot, and hand the rest to Elizabeth's government. This simultaneously weakened Spain, funded England without raising taxes, and maintained Elizabeth's public facade of peace, while waging undeclared economic warfare. Francis Drake was the most audacious, circumnavigating the globe during a 3-year raiding spree that netted so much Spanish gold, his investors received a 4,700% return. When he returned in 1580, Elizabeth publicly knighted him on his ship while privately negotiating how much of his plunder she'd claim as royal commission. The Spanish ambassador watched in fury as England's queen essentially knighted her most successful thief. These early English explorations weren't noble voyages of discovery but brutal commercial raids. Alongside treasure hunting, many sea dogs engaged in slave trading, particularly John Hawkins, who pioneered the English slave trade with devastating consequences for West Africa. Elizabeth maintained plausible deniability about these activities, publicly expressing shock at her captain's unauthorised adventures, while privately issuing them instructions and investing in their voyages. When the Spanish complained, she'd express outrage, promise investigation, then do absolutely nothing. This naval harassment served a larger strategic purpose. It kept Spain off balance, protected England from invasion by keeping Spanish resources focused on defending treasure fleets, and funded Elizabeth's government through off-the-books piracy instead of unpopular taxation. The Sea Dogs represented Tudor foreign policy at its most pragmatic and ruthless, using officially unofficial adventurers to build England's maritime power while maintaining a diplomatic fiction that the Queen was innocent of their depredations. By 1588, Philip of Spain had finally had enough of his former sister-in-law. Elizabeth had executed his Catholic ally Mary Queen of Scots, supported Dutch rebels fighting against Spanish rule, and let her pirates plunder Spanish treasure ships with impunity. The time had come for the world's superpower to crush this annoying island kingdom once and for all. Philip assembled the largest naval force Europe had ever seen, the Spanish Armada, 130 ships carrying 30,000 men, and enough Catholic priests to reconvert England after conquest. The plan was elegant. The Armada would sail up the English Channel, link with Spanish forces in the Netherlands, and escort an invasion army across to England. What could possibly go wrong? Everything, as it turned out. The English fleet, commanded by Lord Howard and Francis Drake, harassed the crescent-shaped Spanish formation with faster, more manoeuvrable ships. The Spanish strategy required capturing a deep-water port, which the English simply refused to allow. When the Armada anchored at Calais, the English sent 8 flaming fire ships into their midst, forcing the Spanish to cut anchor cables and scatter in panic. The decisive battle at Gravelines saw English ships pounding the Spanish vessels from long range, while staying safely out of reach of Spanish boarding parties. But the true coup de grace came from nature itself. Violent storms scattered the retreating Armada around the British Isles, with many ships wrecking on the rocky coasts of Scotland and Ireland. Elizabeth's famous Tilbury speech captured the moment perfectly. Arriving to inspect troops in a theatrical show of royal courage, she declared, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too." Pure propaganda gold. The Armada's defeat wasn't militarily decisive. Spain remained powerful and built new fleets. But psychologically, it transformed England's self-image from vulnerable island to nascent maritime power. It also conveniently confirmed what many English Protestants already suspected. God clearly favoured Elizabeth and her Protestant nation. The Elizabethan court wasn't just government headquarters. It was Renaissance England's most exclusive club, reality TV show, and gladiatorial arena rolled into one glittering backstabbing package. While Elizabeth sat at its centre like a spider in a jewel-encrusted web, hundreds of nobles engaged in a daily combat of wits, fashion and sexual intrigue. Court life revolved around proximity to the Queen. Courtiers spent fortunes on clothes, jewels and entertainments hoping to catch her eye, knowing that royal favour could transform family fortunes overnight. The resulting fashion arms race produced the era's famously ridiculous styles. Men in padded peascod doublets with bulging stomachs. Women in farthingales so wide they had to turn sideways through doorways. And ruffs so enormous they prevented normal eating or drinking. Sex was political currency in this hothouse environment. While the Virgin Queen theoretically disapproved of extramarital affairs, courtiers conducted discreet liaisons in palace corridors, gardens, and even Elizabeth's own privy chamber. Court marriages were strategic alliances, with ambitious families mapping genealogies like modern corporations plan mergers. This rarefied atmosphere produced the golden age of English culture. Elizabeth, genuinely intellectual, fostered an environment where poetry, music and theatre flourished. Courtiers competed through artistic patronage, not unlike modern celebrities adopting charitable causes. The court became a magnet for talent, including a promising playwright named William Shakespeare, whose company performed for Elizabeth and whose histories conveniently reinforced Tudor propaganda. But beneath the masks, pageants and poetry lurked constant danger. Courtiers' fortunes could collapse with a royal frown. Whispered conversations might be reported to Elizabeth's spymaster, Sir Francis Walsingham. Catholic sympathisers hid their rosaries while Protestant hardliners concealed their disappointment with Elizabeth's moderate religious stance. Elizabeth manipulated this pressure cooker brilliantly, deliberately fostering rivalries between courtier factions, ensuring no single family or individual gained enough power to threaten her rule. It was exhausting, expensive, and soul-destroying for participants, but it created the cultural flowering we still call the Elizabethan age. Behind Elizabeth's carefully constructed public image of the immortal Virgin Queen lay a flesh-and-blood woman who sacrificed normal human happiness on the altar of political stability. Unlike her father, who indulged every personal desire regardless of consequences, Elizabeth subordinated her private self to public duty with ruthless discipline. Her decision to remain unmarried wasn't just political strategy, it meant lifelong denial of legitimate sexual fulfillment and motherhood. Her famous declaration, "I am married to England," sounds romantic until you realise countries make terrible husbands, demanding everything while offering no genuine companionship or emotional support. Her relationship with Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, reveals the personal cost most clearly. They clearly loved each other. Contemporaries noted their charged interactions and private moments stolen during public events. But when his wife died under suspicious circumstances in 1560, Elizabeth realised marriage to Dudley would trigger political disaster. Despite genuine feelings, she relegated him permanently to favourite status, close enough to serve and adore her, but never to have her. The Virgin Queen imagery that secured her power also trapped Elizabeth in an increasingly uncomfortable performance. As she aged, her famous vanity, banning mirrors from her chambers, requiring portraits to show her with youthful features, wasn't just feminine insecurity, it was political necessity. The ageless Virgin Queen couldn't be seen growing old without undermining her carefully constructed mystique. Her later years were marked by loneliness as contemporaries died, leaving her surrounded by a younger generation who knew her only as an icon rather than a woman. When her lifelong sweet Robin Leicester died in 1588, Elizabeth locked herself in her room for days, eventually emerging to find his last letter to her, which she marked "his last letter," and kept in a treasured box beside her bed until her death. Elizabeth's greatest achievement might not have been her political triumphs, but this lifelong sublimation of personal happiness for public duty, a price she paid in full. Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, was the Tudor equivalent of that overconfident frat boy who thinks he's untouchable, handsome, charismatic, and ultimately doomed by his own arrogance. As Elizabeth entered her 60s, the 30-something Essex became her final favourite, combining youthful vigour, military glamour, and a dangerous belief in his own indispensability. Essex started with advantages that would make other courtiers murderous with envy. As Leicester's stepson, he inherited the old favourite's position. His good looks and theatrical chivalry appealed to Elizabeth's romantic side. She once gave him a ring, allegedly promising that if he ever needed mercy, sending it would guarantee forgiveness. But Essex lacked the political intelligence to capitalise on these advantages. While earlier favourites like Leicester and Christopher Hatton had balanced adoration with actual service, Essex treated the ageing queen with increasing disrespect. During one council disagreement, he famously turned his back on Elizabeth, a breach of etiquette so shocking she boxed his ears. His response? Nearly drawing his sword on the monarch. Relationship red flag. His downfall accelerated after military failures in Ireland, where he abandoned his post without permission. Elizabeth placed him under house arrest, a gentle punishment that should have taught him caution. Instead, Essex's response was to launch a harebrained rebellion in 1601, marching through London with 200 supporters expecting common people to rise in his favour. They didn't. The rebellion collapsed within hours. Elizabeth, who had forgiven Essex repeatedly, found herself forced to sign his death warrant. Legend claims he tried sending her ring, but jealous courtiers intercepted it. The truth was simpler. His treason was too public, too dangerous to forgive. Essex's execution broke something in the ageing queen. In her final years, she grew increasingly melancholic, reportedly saying of her former favourite, "I am Richard II, know ye not that," referencing Shakespeare's play about a monarch deposed by a once favourite nobleman. The Tudor court, always dangerous, had consumed its last young lion. As Elizabeth entered her 60s, ancient by Tudor standards, the forbidden question hung over England like a storm cloud. Who would inherit when the Virgin Queen finally died? Elizabeth, who had built a political career on strategic ambiguity, maintained her most frustrating silence on this crucial issue, reportedly flying into a rage whenever courtiers dared raise the subject. The succession question wasn't just political curiosity, it was existential anxiety. England had experienced enough succession crises to know they typically involved armies, executions, and the general population having a thoroughly bad time. Yet Elizabeth refused to name an heir, understanding that doing so would instantly create a rival power centre that would undermine her authority. The leading candidate was James VI of Scotland, son of Mary Queen of Scots. Though his mother had been Elizabeth's Catholic rival, James had been raised a Protestant and had the strongest hereditary claim through his great-grandmother Margaret Tudor. But acknowledging him meant admitting Mary had been rightful queen all along, something Elizabeth couldn't stomach. Other contenders included the Suffolk line descendants, various European royals with tenuous Tudor connections, and even wildcards like Edward Seymour, who had Tudor blood but wasn't technically royal. Each potential heir had supporters quietly positioning themselves for the inevitable power transition. As Elizabeth's health declined, secret correspondence between English courtiers and James increased. Robert Cecil, Elizabeth's chief minister, conducted a masterful shadow diplomacy, effectively arranging the succession while pretending to know nothing about it. Elizabeth herself likely knew what was happening, but maintained plausible deniability, allowing preparations for a smooth transition while never undermining her own authority. In her final days in March 1603, when asked directly about succession, the dying Elizabeth reportedly gestured to indicate James. She died as she had ruled, maintaining control until the very end, yielding only when absolutely necessary, and ensuring England would transition peacefully to its next monarch, without the bloodshed that had marked so many previous successions. When Henry Tudor seized the crown at Bosworth Field in 1485, England was a medieval backwater, poor, politically chaotic, and internationally irrelevant. When Elizabeth died in 1603, she left behind an entirely different country. Protestant, culturally vibrant, financially stable, and poised to become a global power. The Tudor century wasn't just a historical period, it was England's emergence from medieval obscurity into the early modern world. The transformation was comprehensive. Religiously, the Tudors took England from Catholic uniformity to Protestant distinctiveness, creating the unique Anglican compromise that still defines English identity. Politically, they shifted from feudal monarchy towards centralised nation-state, with Parliament increasingly asserting itself against royal prerogative, laying groundwork for both constitutional monarchy and eventually empire. Culturally, Tudor patronage fostered an unprecedented flowering of literature, music and art. Without Elizabeth's court, Shakespeare might have remained an obscure provincial actor, rather than becoming the world's most influential playwright. Tudor architecture spread symmetry and proportion across the English landscape, replacing medieval fortresses with light-filled prodigy houses designed to impress rather than defend. Economically, Tudor policies modernised trade, strengthened the middle class, and established financial institutions that would eventually fund an empire. The foundations of British naval dominance were laid during Elizabeth's encouragement of maritime activity, setting the stage for colonies and global commerce. Even Tudor failures proved consequential. Henry VIII's desperate quest for a male heir, which produced only daughters Mary and Elizabeth plus sickly Edward, inadvertently demonstrated that women could rule effectively, shattering gender barriers in governance centuries before women could even vote. The Tudors weren't visionaries with a master plan. They were pragmatic survivors, improvising solutions to immediate problems, often acting from selfish motives or short-term necessity. Yet their collective improvisations permanently reshaped England, transforming a minor European kingdom into the nucleus of what would become the largest empire in human history. Not bad for a dynasty that began with a Welsh nobody making an absurdly thin claim to a blood-soaked throne.